Welcome to Bible class on the Gospel according to Mark. We're going to be in Mark chapters 15 and 16 today. So if you want to go ahead and be getting your Bibles out and turning to Mark 15, that would be wonderful. I'm preparing these points today for Easter weekend. We are celebrating what early Christians called the Passover of the Lord. Now, we don't literally reenact these events of Holy Week or of this Easter weekend, but we do commemorate these events and in a way participate in these sacred events of that week, and in a certain, I would say, mystical sense, are drawn into those events as we think about them and as we experience them this week. We are experiencing this Easter, of course, in a very different way than we are used to, being under a mandated quarantine. But in a sense, there's a sort of unexpected connection with the first Easter, when the disciples found themselves under duress, locked, secluded behind closed doors. And we can, maybe in a different sense than we usually do, identify with those first believers. Well, as I've done before, I'd like for us to maybe read along with or listen to these last two chapters of Mark. So, Mark 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God?" Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. They were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Amen. This is the word of the Lord. And you may notice, just first of all, the first thing I'll say here is that you may notice that we ended there in verse 8. This is a very abrupt ending to this story and to this entire book. Scholars actually are not unanimous or of a consensus on whether Mark should end at verse 20 of chapter 16, which older translations generally have, or if it should end in verse 8. We have early manuscripts of this same book that ended in different places. We have the long ending through verse 20, and we have this shorter ending that ends where I just ended the reading in verse 8. I'm not sure which it is, though I think it is more likely, and most scholars think it is more likely that it ends here in verse 8. And at any rate, we are familiar with those later resurrection appearances and the so-called Great Commission of Jesus from other Gospels. So I do want us to think about at the appropriate time, maybe how we can make sense of this gospel actually ending as it does there in verse 8. These again are familiar stories to us. If we'll back up a bit to chapter 15, I'm not going to go through each verse here, but I want to maybe highlight some things uh, that will bring out, I think, some of the ironies and some of the main questions that the Gospel of Mark is intending to ask and answer here. I've mentioned before that those two main questions are really, who is Jesus and what does it mean to be his disciple? And these events at the last part of this book are kind of the culmination of the answer, especially to that question, who is Jesus? Because there is a very important, significant revelation and answer to that question that has been developing through this whole book. The one thing I brought out last week toward the end of chapter 14 is simply the irony of the disciple Peter not knowing who Jesus is. He said he would not abandon Jesus. He said he was willing to die for Jesus. And that very same night, when he was put on the spot, he said, I don't know Jesus. I don't know who he is. I don't understand what you're talking about, when people approached him. And we noted the irony there that he was actually telling the truth. He thinks he's lying, but there is a deep truth that he did not get it. He did not understand who Jesus actually is. And so that is a good segue to, I would say, many more ironies we see here in these last two chapters of Mark. And I would sum it up simply by saying that there are events of historical significance and of our significance for our faith, of sacred significance. And all of these events are fraught with a significance that we might say escaped those who were participants in these events. All the actors or agents in these events did not necessarily know exactly what they're saying, the significance of what they're saying and what they're doing here. If you were to pull any kind of one person from the crowd and say, what's going on here? They would say, it's just another crucifixion of another person, whether wrongly or rightly, justifiably condemned by the Roman government. Okay? They saw this sort of thing frequently. But there's more going on here that maybe would have met their eyes. So I'll highlight a few of those things if you want to just look back at these verses. First of all, Pilate is consumed with this question, verses 2 and following. Who is Jesus? He has the opportunity there to ask him that very question. Who are you? And brings that charge against him that the Jewish leaders are bringing, that he's saying he is the king of the Jews. So Pilate is saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus basically points out that Pilate is speaking truth here. Pilate, of course, doesn't recognize it, but there's an irony. Pilate is calling him king of the Jews, all right? Jesus is silent about the charges. We see in verses 4 and 5. And I think it's maybe many reasons for this, but I think one is that he realizes that speaking in defense at this point, for many reasons, would have been pointless. I mean, just on a very kind of human level here, he knew and accepted that this was his fate and that the opponents' minds had been made up. His own disciples don't quite get what Jesus is up to and who he is after years spent with Jesus learning from him. So his opponents aren't about to understand who Jesus is and how he should answer to their satisfaction anyway these charges against him. The insurrectionist and murderer and criminal Barabbas is brought up here. And the question starting in verse 7 is, will they release Jesus or Barabbas? Bar-Abbas is the Aramaic equivalent of son of the Father, a very kind of generic name, but that's what his name means, the son of the Father. And so an irony you have here in this exchange in verse 15 is that the false son of the Father, who is the real insurrectionist here, the real criminal, is released, while the real son of the Father, who was revealed all the way back in chapter 1, remember Jesus is introduced in Mark 1, verses 1 and following as the Son of God. And then at his baptism in chapter 1, the voice from heaven, we'll talk about this again later, but the voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son." And then nowhere else in the book of Mark up to this point has there been a reference to Jesus as the Son of God. The reader knows that, the author knows that, we in the audience know that, but the people in the story are still trying to figure out through all of this who Jesus is. So here we have Bar-Abbas, the son of the Father, while the real son of the Father, as I said, who poses no threat to the state, is not an insurrectionist, is crucified as a rebel. And so we have here the ultimate scene of the righteous in place of the sinner. Verses 17 and 18, where we have the soldiers mocking Jesus. This whole scene, of course, we see it in other Gospels as well, has a very, in-your-face irony here that is probably not lost on us, even if it was on them, that Jesus is being clothed in purple, the royal vestments, and hailed as a king. They're doing this, of course, to mock him, but as they mock, the soldiers are unknowingly speaking the truth. So people still must misunderstand who he is while they simultaneously confess his true identity. So again, the events, what they're saying is kind of greater than what they recognize at the moment. We see the irony also in the sign that's affixed on the top of the cross, which is intended to state the crime being punished. It names Jesus as King of the Jews. I think it's the Gospel of Matthew that brings this irony out a little more, that this kind of infuriated the Jews, the Jewish leaders, that it said this. They wanted to say, no, the crime is claiming to be King of the Jews, but the sign itself names and speaks the truth that he is King of the Jews. So Jesus is crucified, verses 31 and 32. I'd like to bring out this other irony here where the chief priests are saying, and the onlookers are saying, he saved others, but he can't save himself. The irony here and the truth is that if he had saved himself, he wouldn't have saved others. So he still is in this very act saving others, as the Gospel of Mark tells us back in chapter 10 that he came to give his life as a ransom for many. So the truth is that he didn't need to save himself, physically or spiritually. And in all of these events, his opponents continue to reveal in jest, but in truth, his real identity. They are calling him in these verses Messiah and the King of Israel. In their minds, the very fact that Jesus is hanging on a cross discredits his claim and um, any claim to messiahship. Like Peter and the other disciples, these onlookers, and especially the leadership, the establishment, think that Messiah and crucifixion are two incompatible things. He's being crucified, therefore, he's not Messiah. But the whole story reveals that it is precisely in Jesus' willing self-sacrifice that shows his true identity as Messiah. He said it from the beginning in chapter 8 that he's going to suffer. This is what it means to be Messiah, the suffering servant who gives his life as a ransom for many. So we're seeing now, as readers here of the Gospel of Mark, what the disciples themselves could not see, or at least accept, the nature of the Messiah's role. Then we have at the moment of his death, kind of again the climax of this significant event and of the story in Mark, we have, I would say, two moments of revelation that go together here and significantly connect with the first chapter, the opening scenes of this book. And those two moments are there in verses 38 and 39. And they go to revealing his identity. Okay, so verse 38, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. And the from top to bottom indicates this is not of human doing. Okay, the point there is this is kind of a miraculous or at least extraordinary thing that's happening here. The curtain of the temple is torn in two. And then verse 39, a Roman centurion notices how Jesus dies, and probably referring especially to the loud cry that he let out. He says that Jesus is the Son of God, or you could translate maybe that he's a son of a God, but the Son of God, that's fine. What's interesting here is the ambiguity of whether he means this as an actual statement of faith, which is significant. This would be, in either case, this is the first instance we have in the whole Gospel of Mark where a human has said he's the Son of God. Demons have recognized it early on in the book, so that is true. But the first human observer who realizes this about Jesus. The other possibility here, and what I mean by the ambiguity, is that we have an irony and should see this confession in the same way we saw the confession of the soldiers who are mocking Jesus and of the onlookers who are calling him King of the Jews, who are calling him Messiah. Here we have a centurion, perhaps who's kind of shaking his head and saying, as I read it with the inflection, surely this is the Son of God. And again, saying it in jest, who knows what he meant by that, but speaking something true. We have a true revelation here of Jesus' identity, even if the centurion meant it sarcastically. Now, the connection, of course, to chapter 1 here, one is obvious, I think, the confession of Son of God. I'll get to that in a second. One that may not be so obvious is that the verb used here about the heavens being split or torn in chapter 1 is the same word here in chapter 15 to describe the curtain of the temple. It's only used twice in this gospel. It's the word schizo. We get the word schism from this. So the curtain of the temple was torn, all right? Well, the heavens were, in chapter 1, verse 10, torn at Jesus' baptism. And that was a moment of revelation. The heavens were torn, and the voice said, the voice from heaven, the Father says, this is my Son. All right. Well, here in chapter 15, we have the curtain being torn. Now, which curtain was this? There were two curtains in the temple. The writer Josephus, who was a contemporary and an eyewitness, an actual priest, in the temple is the only eyewitness testimony we have of the temple in the first century. And he describes it in his book on the Jewish War. In book 5, he has a fairly detailed description of the Jerusalem temple. And he mentions that there is, from the entrance of the outside to the temple, to the holy place, a huge curtain. Now, there was a smaller curtain between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary. But there's a huge curtain. He says 55 by 16 cubits. So we're talking about 75 feet high curtain here by 16 cubits. So what, about 24 feet wide, and also very thick, about probably a hand breadth thick curtain here. And he describes what it looked like. He calls it that it's made of Babylonian tapestry, and he describes its beauty very briefly, but it's colored with blue and scarlet and purple. And he says that all of these things stand for really the whole of reality, the whole universe of nature. And he says at the top of it, you have, and he didn't actually say the top, but I'm picturing this myself. You have, he says, an image of the whole of heaven, a view or image of the whole heaven or the whole sky, okay? So if we're thinking that that's the curtain that's being torn here, you actually have an image of the heaven, same word used in Mark 1, the sky, the heaven being torn in this curtain. And so a revelation there from God, just like we have at Christ's baptism. Heaven was torn, and here again at his death, heaven, in a sense, was again torn. Now, what's the significance of the tearing curtain? I think it could be access to God, that we do have access to God. I think more specifically, it's simply that God is tearing heaven open to say something, okay, either literally or figuratively, to reveal something to us about who Jesus is. He reveals it in Mark 1. The Father himself tears heaven open and says, "This is my son." Here at this kind of the gloomiest part of the gospel story, Jesus dies, the curtain is torn, heaven is torn, and it is the centurion who speaks, perhaps in jest, speaking the truth, "This is the Son of the God." In both cases of tearing here, the point is God is doing something, and he has indeed not abandoned Jesus, revealing himself at first in the life of Jesus and now in the death of Jesus. So it's these moments of revelation that are directly from God. Probably all I want to say then there about those ironies when it comes to the scenes of Jesus' crucifixion. Chapter 15 ends just, and I'll say briefly, with portraits of other disciples here. We have the women who are also disciples who have helped Jesus throughout his ministry from the beginning in Galilee. They are highlighted here, that they were part of that company who has followed Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem and helped him along the way. Of all his disciples, they are the only ones, these women are the only ones who have enough courage and enough compassion to at least watch from a distance. The others, apparently, in this gospel are nowhere to be found. And even when they haven't been named in the story, I want you to know that they've been there, apparently throughout all of Jesus' ministry here. So the importance of the women is brought out here, and it will be brought out here in chapter 16 as well. The other disciple who shows some boldness here while the inner circle of Jesus' disciples fled is Joseph of Arimathea. Makes a risky move here by boldly going and asking to care for the body of a condemned criminal. So that could get him in trouble not only with his colleagues in the Sanhedrin, but also with Pilate. So by implication, he's associating himself with Jesus here. That could raise some suspicion about him to these opponents. So while Peter's denying, Joseph of Arimathea is stepping up and saying, yeah, I am one of him, or one of his number. I am sympathetic with Jesus. A question maybe for us to think about as we try to tie a lot of this together is, from the disciples' perspective, what do you think was the most surprising thing about Jesus? And it doesn't have to be just here in chapter 15. It could be anywhere in the Gospel of Mark. From their perspective, given what they were anticipating about a Messiah and what they were following Jesus for in the beginning, the fact that they're not following him now, what do you think are some surprising things, or the most surprising thing that would have been made known to them about Jesus? And maybe as a follow-up to that, again, after this study of Mark, and particularly in light of this crucifixion narrative, how have you been surprised, or what aspect of Jesus have you seen maybe more clearly than you have before, having gone through these readings of Mark? Well, then we have chapter 16. Briefly, I'll say a few things about this resurrection scene, and maybe just bring out some implications and summarize here. But we have, of course, meeting on the first day of the week, what we would call Easter Sunday. And it's the women who are there. So it's those same women who are showing some courage and going and to anoint Jesus' body, and they don't find it. All right. And the ultimate revelation is given to them that Jesus is risen. So some summaries just of all of these final scenes and chapters here that come to my mind. I have four things here. One is the significance of forgiveness and the second chance. We see this here in verse 7, when the man in white says to the women, "Go tell the disciples and Peter about this." The disciples, and even singling out Peter in a way, this one who last time we saw him was denying Jesus. So remember, Mark has been pretty hard on the disciples, and pretty hard especially on Peter, and rightly so. Okay, they've shown nothing but ignorance and misunderstanding and irrational fear through all of this, even while they talk big. All that aside, that's not the end of the story. And so I think there's an encouragement here for us that while the call to discipleship is a difficult one, it's one that we sometimes fail in this task. And we know that there's mercy there, that Peter is still part of the group. I think his weeping bitterly after the denial indicates his penitence. And here we have him, in a way, sort of being reinstated. What we see maybe in a fuller version in John chapter 21, that Peter's still part of the group. He gets a second chance here. And praise God for forgiveness and the second chances he gives to us. Two, a thing I would want to bring out here is that now we know who Jesus is, and it's been revealed to us. He is the obedient Son of the Father, willing to put it all on the line, and thus he is, because of that, exalted and glorified by God. So the announcement that the crucified Messiah is now risen completes the picture of who Jesus is. His identity, and we've seen hints of that all along throughout this gospel, is now clearly revealed and vindicated by God. 3, what will you do with this knowledge? First, we see what the women do with it. And we have here in verse 7 the opposite of the messianic secret. You may remember throughout the Gospel of Mark that Jesus will, something will sort of reveal his identity, whether it's a miracle or the disciples confessing that he's the Messiah or he's transformed before them. And he'll always say, or most often say, not always, don't tell anyone about this. So it's like, keep it a secret, okay? In chapter 9, verse 9, after the transformation or transfiguration, he tells the disciples, don't tell anyone about this until after I have risen from the dead, all right? So here we have the reversal of the messianic secret. He has risen from the dead, and we have a very clear command that's the opposite of what he said throughout this book, and that is now, go and tell. Go and tell. What do they do? Trembling and astonished, they, verse 8, said nothing to no one. This is sort of a literal translation. Said nothing to no one, for they were afraid. They feared. Right? So the gospel kind of ends with this, they didn't go tell. They were afraid. That fear was still there even after the resurrection. Now, of course, Mark's readers knew the end of the story. We know the end of the story. Someone eventually, and these women, of course, did tell. They did tell. They didn't end with the silence. They told, or else we wouldn't know about this. Nobody would have known about this. So the news was spread far and wide, but I think it's kind of leaving us in that position again of what will we do with this knowledge? Just as Jesus was revealed to them, he has been revealed to us. So the question that is important for us is, do you clearly see who Jesus is? Do you believe? Now what? Will you be fearful, or will you go and tell? As I said last time, when we're confronted by the opponents and those who would be hostile to us, will we tell, or will we shrink back in fear as Peter did, or as apparently these women did at first? They were afraid. So here's a final irony in this book is now Jesus is revealed. Now the message is wide open, and they shut it down. Okay. How will we respond? Finally, the thing I would bring out is simply an Easter message, and that is that death does not reign. We hear a lot about death these days, seeing some big numbers, and maybe we don't know what to make of it. But the point here is that our God is the God of the living and of all that is. Death may intrude, death may rear its ugly head, it will, but it doesn't have the final word. Life reigns. Father, we're thankful for these words from the Gospel of Mark. We pray that as our eyes might be opened through the power of your Spirit to see who Jesus is, that we would have also empowerment by your Spirit to act on that knowledge, that we would not be afraid, that we would not misunderstand, but that we would understand clearly, and that we would have a passion for spreading the word about Jesus through our words and through our deeds to those around us, first in our families and to our neighbors and to those we work with, that we would be a light that shines in a dark place. Thank you for shining that light of life and truth in our lives. And may that love and peace ever be before us. For Jesus we pray. Amen.